0530, Hansfeld. A tiger's engine coughed once and died. It was not a howl of armor pierced by an enemy shell, but the flat, humiliating silence of a machine that had nothing left to burn. The commander climbed out on the mud-choked glacis, fingers black with oil. He cupped his hands to his mouth and breathed in the cold dawn, diesel, metal, and, impossibly, the sharp, sweet tang of gasoline. Below the road, stacked like a grotesque offering, were pyramids of American jerry cans, neat lines, crusted with mud, the stenciled names on some still faintly legible. Men were laughing. They had been trained to expect miracles of steel. They had not been trained to expect abundance left just beyond their reach. "You'd think we'd hit a supply train," one man said. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman, who later read the captured manifest, remembered the laugh as testimony to a kind of stunned relief. We celebrated like winning the lottery. The manifest Hoffman unrolled was a simple sheet, stamped and dated. It listed quantities, destinations, bill of lading numbers. 50,000 gallons, the paper said, a neat figure beneath the header. 50,000 gallons seemed, in that moment, endless. For men whose operations had been measured in whispers of fuel and rationed kilometers, it was sudden wealth. They started siphoning and pouring. Cans were opened with helmets and bayonets. Engines coughed awake. A Sherman down the lane roared to life like an answered prayer. For a few hours at least, the advance would breathe. That breath, however, was shallow. The captured cache at Hansfeld, 50,000 gallons, was real enough, but it was also a fragment, a small mirror held up against an ocean. Far from being salvation, it was a cruel joke, a bottle of water to firefighters standing in front of a blaze. The Germans needed millions to operate at scale. The Americans, by contrast, had entire logistical systems built to replace losses, to flood battlefields with motion. The discovery at Hansfeld offered a human-scale triumph. A crew laughed, refueled, moved. Seen from the operational map, it barely dented a problem baked into planning weeks earlier. If you step back from the mud and iron and read the numbers that mattered to strategists, the ones scribbled into logistics tables rather than diaries, the disparity becomes less anecdote and more verdict. Allied refining in 1944 ran in the order of 1.8 billion barrels. German refining capacity, synthetic and scarred by bombing and shortages, was measured in the tens of millions. Figures like 33 million barrels appear in period summaries. Those are not friendly approximations. They are the arithmetic of movement. One side could spool out fuel like a factory turns out rivets. The other had to coast each kilometer from chemistry and desperation. For the men at Hansfeld, the arithmetic was less abstract. Men kept moving until the tanks stopped.
They idled to keep guns warm. They circled and waited for orders. They pushed vehicles into better firing positions. They burned precious liters just to get to a vantage point, only to find the next objective untouched. A tiger was magnificent and terrible in action, but it was a creature of appetite. Heavy armor devoured gallons the way a locomotive eats coal. To win a duel in armor required not just steel and training, but a ledger full of fuel entries. Hoffman read the manifest aloud to anyone who would listen. The paper had names of depots and a scrawled destination for First Army. Some entries stamped in a language the Germans had learned to fear only months before. A translation, partial and clumsy, told the same story as the lines of cans. The Americans moved oil from ship to shore to truck to pipeline and back into the tanks. The Germans saw movement and felt hunger. If you want to understand the Ardennes in winter, you must see it as both a map of foxholes and a graph of flows. The spearhead that General Sepp Dietrich hoped to drive into Antwerp lived or died by dots on a ledger as much as by commanders' wills. Fuel shortages were not a single event or a bad decision. They were the arithmetic of a nation at war without the wells and refineries to support one. This realization that logistics would often have the last word came slowly to the men who had trained to measure victory by hits and kills. It became visceral in the simplest of acts, siphoning, pouring, tasting the metal tang of fuel on gloved hands, reading manifests with breath white in the air. When a young private crouched beside a Sherman and pried open a faucet, he was not performing a heroic act so much as addressing the most prosaic of needs. Yet these small acts, strung along the lines of advance, created the conditions for movement. If this thread of the story intrigues you and you want more deep dives into the machinery behind the front lines, stick with us through this episode. We'll break down not just what happened at Hansfeld, but why the pipelines, convoys, and decisions far from the battlefield wrote the ending that brave crews never controlled. Beyond the personal, the Allied logistical network had scale and redundancy baked in. There was Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, whose very name sounds like a technical marvel, and the Red Ball Express, a ceaseless ripple of trucks that became, for a time, the circulatory system of an entire theater. These systems were not elegant, they were brute force. Convoys ran round the clock, drivers signed up in waves, fuel was pumped, stored, and moved in a rhythm that would have sounded grotesque to the planners in Berlin who were already pruning kilometers from their allocation spreadsheets. Pluto's capacity and the Red Ball's throughput are the kind of numbers that bend a campaign.
When a pipeline can keep tens of thousands of gallons flowing daily into a theater, commanders can plan maneuvers that presuppose movement, not miracles. The Red Ball Express moved tens of thousands of tons each week, a rolling wall of steel and canvas that refused to stop. Men in trucks, many of them barely older than boys, learned to drive under blackout and shell fire because the alternative to motion was immobility for the entire force. There is a grim symmetry to be noticed in these systems. The very structures that enabled the Allies to press their advantage also created targets. Fuel depots were sanctuaries and potential infernos. When engineers read manifest after manifest in the captured stacks at Hansfeld, they also calculated the temptation for the Germans to weaponize what they could capture. To the attackers, fuel was not merely an input, it was leverage over movement, morale, and even the psychology of an enemy conditioned to scarcity. Back at the shaft of the front line, small tactical details compounded the strategic picture. Traffic clogged the Ardennes' narrow roads, not the cinematic flow of armored columns, but the grinding reality of mixed traffic. Fuel trucks, troop carriers, tanks, artillery, and civilians fleeing the path. A single blown bridge or a stalled tank could snarl movement for hours. Tanks sat idling and chewed through precious fuel, while crews argued about detours. Delays meant time and burned gallons, and eroded the capacity to strike when the moment demanded it. Captain James Rose, who kept a diary in the period, noted these penumbras of logistics, even as he described the day-to-day conduct of battle. He wrote of columns stalled for hours, of men pushing and of drivers walking back to fuel up the engines. Rose's entries are a soldier's view of logistics, not the boardroom charts, but the smell of exhaust, the bitterness of waiting, the slow hunger of an apparatus in motion. Those delays, multiplied across a theater, translated into fewer tanks reaching a ridge in time to exploit a gap, fewer artillery pieces being in place when needed, fewer men with the fuel to make patrols of reconnaissance. The Germans felt it in other ways. Their synthetic fuel program, chemistry and coercion turned into energy, had sustained them into 1944, but the program had limits. Allied bombing and resource strain choked production, and the German rationing system, with its frugal kilometers, meant that tactical initiative depended on the kind of allocation that only high command could authorize. When the spearhead sought to race for a prize, orders had to be balanced against the ledger. To advance recklessly was to risk stranding crews with silent engines in hostile country. That is why incidents like Hansfeld were as much psychological as they were tactical. Men who had been told to conserve suddenly saw abundance and allowed themselves to imagine a longer reach.
For a moment, the arithmetic of scarcity gave way to an illusion of parity. They opened cans and felt like winners, but the rest of the map remained stubbornly unchanged. Other existing Allied practices hardened the effect. The Americans destroyed fuel deliberately when capture seemed likely to benefit the enemy more than their own operations. Stivalo, a depot referenced repeatedly in captured logs and journal entries, became a ritual of denial. According to several witness accounts in the file, engineers poured gasoline into open pits and set it alight. White phosphorus grenades were used in some explosions. Whole mountains of stored fuel became a column of black smoke that could be seen for miles. Technical Sergeant Paul Salas is recorded as the man who threw the first grenade at Stivalo. There is a short clipped line attributed to him in the accounts. We couldn't let it go. Those words are weary rather than vindictive. The aim was pragmatic, to deny the Germans what they so desperately needed. That denial was itself a kind of weapon, one that burned as much as it saved. A depot that could not be held, they reasoned, should not be allowed to become the engine of an enemy's advance. There is a horror to this calculus. Men watched gasoline, life for a machine, and by extension life for a unit's mobility, go up in flames. Flames rose into the winter sky, black smoke painting the low clouds. Soldiers on both sides stood and watched convoys of light leap and die. For the Germans, these burned depots were not only material losses, they were a theatrical demonstration that the opponent could afford to waste what they could scarcely get. It was bread to watch being thrown into the sea. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion remembered Stavelot later in an after-action note. He described the logistics detail of demolition: trucks backed up, pumps reversed, crews working with frayed gloves and shaking hands. Sometimes they poured and ignited in daylight, sometimes at night. The destruction was methodical. The aim was to keep the enemy from replenishing momentum. In the moments after the fire started, he wrote, there was a solemnity to it. Men removed gloves, saluted nothing, and moved on. The result was paradoxical. The Americans could burn millions of gallons and still have enough left to keep pushing because their supply lines were not single-threaded. The British and Americans had diversified sources, captured ports, pipeline initiatives, cross-channel transfers, and a civilization of industry that could convert steel and oil into motion at a scale Germany could not match. The sight of the enemy setting their own wealth aflame was strangely disorienting. For German soldiers already taught to ration their lives by kilometers of fuel, it was a kind of psychological collapse.
If your enemy can afford to destroy what you need, what hope is left but to gamble everything for a handful of cans? That gamble manifested in other battlefield friction, small pockets of resistance, American infantry left behind to harass, artillery strikes timed to hit supply columns, or even a single demolished bridge could stall an advance for days. Traffic jams formed, and because time and fuel were linked, a jam was not simply inconvenience, it was attrition by logistics. The Ardennes, with its narrow lanes and frozen hollows, favored bottlenecks. A hollowed-out convoy could become a graveyard of equipment and potential. Into this granular landscape of supply and delay, we must now place the title's dramatic motif, the 17-pounder and the mocked Sherman. The famous line about German aces laughing at Shermans until something changed is evocative and true in spirit. The precise engagement implied by the headline, a singular 17-pounder tearing tigers apart, is not narrated in the captured Hansfeld manifest. What follows is therefore a representative vignette, a composite scene, drawn from multiple small anti-tank encounters intended to show how material solutions and tactical adaptation could intersect with the larger logistical story, treated as illustration, not a pinpointed claim. On a frosted ridge a few kilometers from a supply road, an Allied anti-tank section had been moved into a hasty camouflaged position. The gun was the 17-pounder, the British long 76mm that in late 1944 had proven itself, when properly sighted, capable of penetrating the frontal armor of even a Tiger at combat ranges under the right conditions. A crew of 6 had trained for nights like this, cold hands, precise drills, and the weary knowledge that their round supply was finite. A patrol reported Tigers moving along the valley. The report was thin and unverified. The anti-tank crew braced, loaded, and waited. A Tiger rounded the copse, its tracks carving a black furrow into the snow. It was glorious to behold, the sheer bulk, the turret like a domed crown. The German who spotted the camouflaged gun would later say he felt invincible in that moment. We had the best armor, he said in a testimonial recorded after capture, but not the gallons to make it move. The 17-pounder's first shot found its mark. The Tiger groaned, shuddered, and stopped. Smoke leaked from its turret roof. Later, in this composite telling, another 17-pounder, or perhaps a Sherman Firefly with the British gun fitted under American camouflage, cut another Tiger as it tried to overrun a roadblock. These were not miraculous exceptions. They were the product of technology and deployment. A hard-hitting gun, sighted with care, fed rounds by crews who had been trained to take a single decisive shot. Yet the tactical success of an anti-tank gun in such an encounter cannot be disentangled from logistics.
A 17-pounder is only as useful as the ammunition that reaches its crew, as the tractors that drag it into position, as the rations that keep the men warm while they wait. The Allies were able to field these weapons in numbers and to move them into effective positions because their supply networks allowed it. The presence of a Firefly or a 17-pounder did not single-handedly turn a campaign, but it became symbolic, the material depth to adapt, to fit a potent gun into the hull of a vehicle, and to keep its crews fed and munitioned. From the German perspective, such scenes were a bitter new variable in a war that had already been tilted against them by resource scarcity and Allied air superiority. Every loss of an armored vehicle to a crew-served weapon diminished a formation that could not be easily replaced. Tanks, once struck by fate and empty of fuel, were often abandoned intact. Men pushed and towed and drained the last ounces of petrol in hopeless attempts to haul a 50-ton machine to safety. If the 17-pounder caught a Tiger's weak spot, it simply hastened the demise of an already precarious chess piece. It is worth pausing on the psychology here. Aces mocked Shermans because, on the face of it, Shermans were lighter, less protected, and had a poorer raw chance in a one-on-one slugfest with a Tiger. But mocking is air. The heavier the logistical backbone behind the mockery, the less it mattered. The Sherman could be replaced in a theater. The Tiger could not be produced in the same numbers, nor fueled consistently enough to maintain a strategic advantage. To a German crew staring at a stack of Allied cans or a burning depot they had no hope to salvage, mocking a Sherman was both bravado and consolation. This representative engagement, the 17-pounder bringing down a Tiger, ends in the cold, with men crouched and smoking, and a horizon freckled with the flares of distant fires where fuel dumps were being denied. It is, in short, an image that ties together the campaign's two poles, the human tactical struggle and the massive indifferent arithmetic of supply. The gun took a tank. Logistics determined how many such exchanges could be afforded. Even as these micro-dramas unfolded, higher-level decisions continued to feed the machine. Radio logs, shipment manifests, and the schedules of convoys were the real scripts. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for the First Army in period documents, is recorded as stressing the primacy of maintaining throughput rather than chasing individual crises. His memos, terse and businesslike, argued that a theater could absorb losses only if the flow of supplies remained within a margin. That kind of margin was thinner for Germany by 1944 than it had been in earlier campaigns. Allied industry and sea power meant that new margins could be carved out on demand. There were also subtle effects.
The spectacle of burned fuel, the sight of captured manifests listing faraway refineries, and the sound of endless trucks moving. These were not merely practical advantages. They carried a symbolic weight. Soldiers, like all humans, read the world for signs. When your opponent can throw away millions of gallons without blinking, you are tempted to accept the narrative that you are fighting an enemy not in scarcity, but in surplus. The moral and psychological consequences of that perception rippled through the German forces in December 1944. We have followed a number of threats to this point: the small human triumph at Hansfeld, the arithmetic of barrels and gallons at the strategic level, the savagery of deliberate denial at Stavelot, and the representative scene in which a 17-pounder kills a Tiger. Each of these threads is a different scale of the same fabric. What remains unsettled is how these threads knot together in the crucial hours ahead. Will the captured cans at Hansfeld turn a local skirmish into a bigger success? Or are they, as so many commanders feared, merely a temporary reprieve before the cold arithmetic of logistics forces a choice no man on the front can make? As the morning thickened into a brittle winter light, the men at Hansfeld finished siphoning what they could. Engines warmed, radios chatted, and a lull, soft as an intake of breath, passed over the field. Some men laughed awkwardly, the sound of joy thin and brittle. Others set about camouflaging the captured supplies, writing notes and loading manifest copies into pockets and notebooks. Hoffman folded his pages and tucked them away. He would later present them as evidence of the scale and source of the supply: stamps, dates, port names. At that moment, however, all that mattered to the crews was motion. Motion is the compound of war, motion sustained by fuel, steered by commanders, and constrained by pipelines and factories. The next day would test both the bravery and the bookkeeping of armies. Convoys would meet snow, bridges would be shot up,
and men would be forced to make choices about what to feed the engines and what to leave behind. The captured 50,000 gallons was a story within the larger storyline of attrition and supply. It was not yet the turning point, but it was the kind of human detail that would, in aggregated form across many such moments, help decide who could keep more tanks moving when and where it mattered. In the shadow of charred depots and smoking roads, the winter front kept its secrets. Men put their hands on metal and measured their futures by gauges and by gut. A Tiger, great and proud, sat with its engine cold. Nearby, a pile of American cans gleamed with a bureaucratic neatness that mocked the exhausted orderlies who had to decide which vehicles would taste that fuel and which would not. Above them, unseen, the pipes that carried oil into theater continued their slow, steady work.
The arithmetic of barrels and miles went on, indifferent to the shard of joy and the momentary motion that Hansfeld had afforded. There was an uneasy lull before a bigger reckoning, a reckoning that would involve fires planned to deny, engines left to freeze, and the next set of orders that commanders in both camps would issue as the winter tightened its grip. The men who had laughed and cried over cans would find themselves very soon measuring success in kilometers of road opened, in tanks that could still climb, and in the cold calculation of how many liters it took to change a front. Convoys met the day like animals that had been driven too far. Snow crusted the windshields. Radios hissed with voices missing whole syllables. Bridges that had once been lifelines leaned in twisted shapes where shells had scored them. Other crossings were choked with the hulks of vehicles that had slid into ditches and never been shoveled out. Men pushed. Men cursed. Men walked back to the nearest pump to siphon half a jerry can into a gutted engine to see if it would cough one more time. The ledger of kilometers to be gained was being paid for in small, humiliating increments. A Tiger stuck broadside in a rutted lane became a monument to that ledger. Crews clambered over its tracks with ropes and winches, hooked on to other hulls, and tried to drag the beast free. Tow cables snapped. Men spat on frostbitten fingers. They siphoned every reserve, even pouring motor oil into tanks as a superstition against stalling. That the ship of steel would not move was sometimes not due to a shell, but to a lack of the very thing that made motion possible: fuel. Where shell holes might be fixed by a crew or a workshop, an empty tank was a sentence. In different cases, the arithmetic read the same. Small American teams, engineers, and infantry harried supply columns with raids or demolitions that were not aimed to annihilate the enemy's fighting power so much as to throttle the bloodline of movement. A burned bridge in a hollow was not glamorous, but it could be decisive. For hours, days, or weeks, a whole formation could twist itself into knots around one gap. Near that gap, mechanics would huddle around frozen engines, cylinders willing but dry. The answer to the question, why did they stop, was increasingly because they had no fuel left to go on. Not every Tiger was left intact. Some burned with the visceral spectacle of a machine finally denied the breath of motion. Others were stripped like carcasses when a crew decided to salvage what they could. Optics, radio sets, bolts of electrical wiring, parts that could keep one vehicle online elsewhere or keep a gun firing a little longer. Cannibalization became a practice of survival. The vast, elegant edifice of armored warfare was suddenly patchwork. Panels and tubes donated from one dead giant to another living, if only for a day. The decision to abandon a tank was never merely mechanical. It was a moral and psychological surrender to arithmetic. A crew that dismounted from a machine and left it, keys in the ignition, ammo racks full, did so under compulsion, either to save themselves or because orders told them to make the unit slip away on foot. The man who closed the hatch for the last time often did so with a quiet that was not defeat alone, but an acceptance of a larger scale of loss. That quietness was echoed by the landscape. Long lines of abandoned steel, black against the white, glinting like wreckage from a world that had run out of the things required to keep it moving. The Allied side recorded its own pragmatics. Where German columns became mired, American engineers read manifests and maps and decided which depots must be kept and which must be destroyed. The calculus was brutal. If a depot could not be held and the enemy could profit from its contents, better to feed it to flame.
The destruction of Stivalo was not a spontaneous fury, but a known and rehearsed act. Men poured fuel into pits, chained drums together, set charges, and tossed incendiaries. The black smoke that rose from those pits was a marker, not simply of destruction, but of strategy. Deny the enemy what they could not secure. Witnesses wrote about the spectacle in small, stunned phrases. Paul Salas said, "We couldn't let it go." Captain John Brewster described crews working with gloves shredded by the friction of pumps and ropes, faces set like stone. A soldier who had watched a depot become an inferno remembered a kind of ceremonial sadness. This too was business. Men stood, saw flames take what might have saved lives, and walked away because the alternative was to hand mobility to the enemy on a silver platter. The effect on the German mind was layered. There was practical anger. How could they be denied fuel when they needed it? And there was a deeper disorientation. Soldiers who had learned to ration their lives by kilometers of road watched Allied men pour petrol into pits and strike a match. Where previously the scarcity of fuel had been an abstract constraint, the sight of controlled, deliberate destruction turned scarcity into a performance. If the enemy could afford to waste, what would be left for those trying to buy movement with measured leaders? In the weeks after Hansfeld, supply columns were the battleground as much as ridgelines and crossroads. Night after night, convoys tried to thread narrow lanes while artillery pounded supply dumps and forward fuel points. Men learned to sleep with their boots on. Drivers who had begun as boys became curators of a fragile lifeline. They guarded their cargoes as if each jerry can were a legacy. Losses mounted, not only through enemy action, but through attrition, the wear of distance, the failure of parts, the winter's bite. At the operational level, the numbers spoke with a bluntness that overruled rhetoric. The Allied refining figure,
8 billion barrels for 1944, hovered like a mathematical verdict. Germany's synthetic program, admirable in its chemistry and desperate in its resource stretch, yielded figures in the order of tens of millions. Numbers like 33 million barrels appear repeatedly in period summaries. Those figures are not moral judgments, they are arithmetic. Where one side could field an industrial stream measured in billions of barrels, the other scraped a supply measured in the low tens of millions. It is in that gap, vast and measured, that many tactical incidents find their larger explanation. Production of vehicles and munitions fed the same engine. The Allies could replace tanks and guns at a rate Germany could not match. But crucially, they could also keep feeding those replacements with a steady stream of fuel. A tank without production is still a tank. A tank without fuel is a heavy coffin. The supply chain, not exclusively the factory floor, determined whether steel met the moment. It is here that Pluto and the Red Ball Express move from ingenuity to strategic force. Pluto carried oil under the channel and ashore, its conception a testament to industrial logistics that saw pipes laid from one continent to another. The Red Ball Express created a rolling artery, thousands of trucks and drivers who moved everything from tires to crude fuel in a relentless pattern. How much fuel flowed mattered. Pluto moved thousands, and in some phases tens of thousands of barrels per day, indefinite in precise day-to-day throughput, while the Red Ball Express's convoys delivered tens of thousands of tons per week across the theater. These figures, when combined with port throughput and convoy capacity, made up a margin, an ability to replace, to resupply, to keep motion continuous. That margin collapsed against the German side into a brittle set of numbers that could not sustain repeated losses. Bombing and blockade and the stretching of resources had already hollowed out the German capacity. What remained could not be stretched further without breaking. There were tactical consequences that read like a ledger. A Tiger on the move consumed fuel at a rate that made it a strategic statement as much as a weapon. It required not only its own gallons, but the supply tail that made maintenance, towing, and replacement possible. The Panther, the heavy trucks, supply tractors, and even aircraft together formed a consumption profile that dwarfed the modest caches that could be overrun in a raid. Specific daily consumption rates for types of vehicles vary with conditions and are sometimes unclear in fragmented records. To put it bluntly, a heavy tank in winter operations could be the equivalent of several trucks in consumption over the course of a campaign. Indefinite for precise per vehicle daily gallons in this transcript. The point is not arithmetic precision here, but scale. Tanks were not independent actors. They were nodes in a logistics network that required constant feeding.
That realization changes how we read heroism and loss. When a small anti-tank team with a 17-pounder felled a tiger, that was tactical brilliance. When a depot burned, that was operational decision. Both mattered, but at different registers. A gun could turn a local tide. A pipeline could tilt a theater. Both were interdependent. The Allies' ability to slot a 17-pounder into a Sherman hull, to train crews in its use, and to fuel those crews so they could wait in the cold and pull the trigger at the right second, was a logistic victory as much as it was a tactical one. Conversely, German crews were forced into fights where their material scarcity made brilliance expensive and often fatal. The psychological effect on German ace crews deserves a note. There is testimony, fragmentary, bitter, about the mocking and derision with which some German tankers treated Shermans in the earlier phases of fighting. The Sherman was lighter, often outgunned, and in a one-on-one duel at range, a Tiger could be expected to dominate. That mocking sustained morale when numbers were held in check, but when that morale confronted scenes of Allied abundance, piles of jerry cans, columns of trucks that seemed endless, depots burned because they could not be kept, reflexive scorn evaporated. It became, in many cases, a bitter, private recognition that industrial depth had overtaken face-to-face combat as the decisive variable. The hours following the deliberate denial of fuels showed a grim arithmetic. A German panzer regiment, ordered to press forward toward a canal, found its lead elements stalled in a bottleneck. Artillery harassed the rear. Skirmishes with small pockets of American infantry forced further delays. Each minute idle consumed fuel, in idling engines, in warm-up cycles, in the motion of life support for the crew. When finally an order arrived to withdraw a damaged tank, men pushed and heaved and tried to tow. They managed some. Others were left with their keys on the dashboard, hatches open, and a surrender that was not shame alone, but acceptance of logistics' verdict. In other spots, the war took on a surreal character. Stories circulated of German crews who, after watching a depot burn, wandered into ruined villages in search of any leftover fuel, kitchen stoves, cans and cellars, even lamps that might yield a spoonful. Scavenging became an act of desperation. Where one side could buy barrels with the currency of industry, the other looked for drip pans and discarded tins. The image of a man crawling into a farmhouse to pry a rusty tin from a cupboard so that he might move his tank a few more hundred yards is a human picture of a structural deficit. The costs of those deficits were operational and moral. They eroded initiative and created a multiplication effect. Delay by delay, delay increased consumption. Consumption depleted allocation. Depletion forced hard choices about which unit would get to move and which would be left behind. Commanders learned, sometimes too late, that in order to advance without fuel was a cruel instruction. A spearhead that had the audacity of plan but not the currency to enact it found itself unraveling under its own ambition. Against this backdrop, tactical improvisations appeared. German crews, deprived of fuel and replacement parts, started stripping their own vehicles and reconfiguring them with what remained. Guns were mounted on trucks. Old lorries became escorts for captured tanks. These improvisations were testimony to resilience, but they could not substitute for the steady, industrial replenishment that sustained the Allied push. They were, in arithmetic, stopgaps. The Allies, by contrast, could accept loss as a function of throughput. A burned depot at Stavelot was a strategic cost rather than a crippling one. The machinery of British and American logistics had the elasticity to absorb the deliberate waste and maintain momentum. Those who set the fires knew the price and paid it willingly because the alternative, to hand a mobile force to an enemy, was worse. The image of thousands of gallons of fuel burning under a winter sky is therefore both tragedy and calculated prevention. There is an irony here that cuts to the heart of the title itself. German aces had laughed at Shermans because on paper, Shermans were inferior. But war is not decided on paper alone. Material depth, the ability to field, replace, and fuel, is a kind of arithmetic that turns theory into practice. The 17-pounder vignette is emblematic, a hard-hitting gun emplaced with care, taking a tiger in its sights. But the reason that such guns could be present, manned and munitioned across the theater, was logistics. The 17-pounder did not win campaigns by virtue of metallurgy alone. It did so because supply chains allowed it to be where it needed to be when a tiger presented itself. As the Ardennes offensive sputtered, the maps of the campaign began to look like the records of supply runs. Arrows showing not only lines of advance, but lines of delivery. Quartermasters and logisticians became the unsung commanders of the day. Their memos were terse and businesslike. Their victory, if it can be called that, was the quiet, relentless movement of needed things. Colonel James Snyder's priorities, maintain throughput, absorb losses, keep moving, were not glamorous orders, but theater-level necessities. Where such throughput existed, commanders had latitude. Where it did not, tactical opportunity hardened into operational failure. The final days of that period produced images that would remain. Tigers abandoned in snow, Shermans idling in convoys like a larger, more expendable fleet, columns wreathed in smoke as depots burned, men crouched over skulls of machinery that could not be saved.
Photographs from the time, when they are not blurred by fog and smoke, show a stark contrast. On one side, the carefully stacked cans and certificates of shipment. On the other, the frozen bellies of machines that had no more to eat. The larger statistics, available through wartime procurement and post-war analyses, back the intuition. Allied industrial might and refining throughput dwarfed that of Germany. Where figures like 1.8 billion barrels versus 33 million barrels are invoked, they are not rhetorical flourishes, but foundational facts. They explain why a nation could afford to destroy stockpiles in moments of tactical necessity and still keep pushing. They explain how a seemingly simple adaptation, fielding a powerful anti-tank gun across multiple platforms, could be implemented at scale. And they explain why German planners, wonderfully adaptive and tactically skilled as many were, could not sustain a campaign that demanded a continuous flow of oil. All this is to say that the scene at Hansfeld, so human and immediate, was one thread in a larger fabric. A handful of captured cans could enliven a crew for a morning. A 17-pounder could take a tiger in a single decisive round. But war on the scale of 1944 is not aggregated from single moments alone. It is a sum of continuities. Production lines click day after day. Oil flows through pipes and across seas. Drivers keep their lights out and their eyes forward. These continuities are less glamorous than a tank duel, but they are the sinews of strategic power. When the offensive finally petered out, and men on both sides paused to count losses and measure prospects, the inventory told a clear story. German formations that had once seemed poised to split the front found themselves lacking the basic mobility to exploit even temporary openings. The Allies, for all their own losses, retained the means to mend and replace. The result was not a single moment of decisive truth, but an accumulation, attrition, denied supplies, burned depots, clever anti-tank employment, exhausted crews, all braided together into the final outcome. In the cold light after the fighting, the abandoned tigers stood silent testimony. They were magnificent and terrible, hulks that could be preserved in museums and photographs, but their silence was a lesson. A 50-ton machine is only as potent as the barrel that fills it and the fuel that moves it. The irony in the title, German aces laughing at a Sherman until a British gun tore tigers apart, holds as narrative drama, but the fuller truth is deeper and less theatrical. The anti-tank rifle, the clever round, the insight kill, all mattered, but they were sustained by a network of pipes, trucks, docks, and factories that could not be matched by a nation with shrinking access to oil. There is a final, human note. Men who had laughed at the sight of a captured pile of jerry cans later wrote home, not with triumph, but with a weary recognition of contingency. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman tucked away a manifest and later recounted the moment to a small audience, his voice sometimes puzzled by what it had meant. Private Ernst, whose name appears uncertain in records, wrote short lines in a pocket diary, how they had siphoned, how they had burned, how they had walked. These fragments are not political arguments. They are small human testaments to what it feels like when the arithmetic of a war presses down on a person. They do not blame or exonerate. They simply record. If there is a lesson here, it is less about destiny than about the nature of modern conflict. Tactical skill remains essential. Courage and ingenuity on ridgelines and in hedgerows shape moments. Yet those moments are nested inside systems. The man with the 17-pounder may take a tiger in a single hour, and his action will enter history as a flash of metal and smoke. But the conditions that allow such opportunities to place that gun at the right place, to supply its crew, to give them time and ammunition,
come from the slower, more workmanlike processes of industry and logistics. In that sense, the last word often belongs to the unseen, the dock worker, the pipe layer, the truck driver who will not stop. The Tigers at Hansfeld were not mythic failures, they were real machines, both magnificent and mortal. They were undone in many ways, by shells, by skilled gunners, by fires set to depots, and by the cold arithmetic of fuel. When historians count victories, it is tempting to point to single guns or single battles, but history must also look at the flows beneath those battles, the oil running through pipes, the convoys that did not come, the man who burned a depot because a better strategy demanded it. The War of 1944 is a stern lesson in that duality. If this episode resonated with you, check the description for the sources we consulted and for a follow-up where we dig deeper into how anti-tank technology evolved in late 1944 and into 1945. There, we map how tactical adaptations interacted with industrial capacity to shape battle after battle. For now, close your eyes on the image that lingers, a Tiger, great and motionless, its fuel gauge frozen at empty. Nearby, the neat rows of Allied jerry cans, some taken, some left. Beyond them, a pillar of black smoke from a depot burned to prevent a larger danger. And above all, the pipes and ships and factories, far from the cold mud, that quietly decided how many machines would live to fight another day. In the calculus of modern war, production and supply are not background details. They are the arithmetic of victory and defeat.